Lady Clara Beaumont had come to understand the texture of silence. In her uncle's London house, it was a thick, dusty thing, tasting of old paper and quiet desperation. It settled over the mahogany furniture like a shroud, muffling the tick of the mantel clock that measured out the last of her marketable years. At 24, she was a fixture, an unmarried niece with no fortune, as much a part of the sombre decor as the faded tapestries. Her uncle, Lord Fenwick, treated her with the weary patience one might afford a poor investment. His plan for her was a dull, aching certainty in her chest, marriage to a man twice her age with a damp cough and a cruel glint in his eye, a man whose wealth would solve Fenwick's gambling debts. Clara's consent was not a factor in the equation. She was a line item in a ledger, a debt to be paid. She sat in the library, a book open on her lap, its words a meaningless blur. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of leather and decay. She felt her own life decaying with it, turning brittle and dry like the pages of an unread volume. Resignation had become her closest companion, a cold hand resting perpetually on her shoulder. She had no leverage, no escape. Her future felt like a long, dark corridor with a locked door at the end. So when the Duke of Alvan was announced, the name fell into the room's oppressive quiet like a cannonball. He was a man of myth and rumour, a figure of immense wealth and power who rarely appeared in society. He was spoken of in whispers, a ruthless industrialist in an aristocrat's skin, a man who had built a shipping empire that dwarfed his ancient ducal holdings. Her uncle, flustered and sycophantic, hurried to greet him. Clara remained in the shadows of the library, forgotten as usual. It was from this vantage point that she saw him for the first time. He was not what she expected. Tall and severe, yes, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. But his eyes were a startling, deep shade of blue, and his hands, when he removed his gloves, were not the pale, soft hands of a duke. The tips of his long fingers were faintly, but unmistakably, stained with ink. The library doors were left ajar. Clara, frozen in her chair, became an unintentional eavesdropper on the negotiation of her own fate. The Duke's voice was low and devoid of warmth, a precise instrument of commerce. "Fenwick," he began, dispensing with pleasantries, "I am aware of your financial difficulties. I am prepared to erase them." "Every last shilling," Lord Fenwick stammered, a sound of pathetic, grasping hope. "Your Grace, I don't know what to say. The generosity—" "It is not generosity," the Duke cut in, his tone slicing through her uncle's fawning. "It is a transaction. I require a wife, a temporary one. Your niece, Lady Clara. I will marry her, and in return your debts are cleared." Clara's breath caught in her throat. The book slipped from her numb fingers and landed on the carpet with a soft thud. A wife, a temporary wife. The words were so cold, so clinical, they seemed to strip the very air of heat. "My niece?" her uncle squeaked. "Clara? She is of good family, unmarried, and, forgive my bluntness, unlikely to have other prospects that would complicate matters," the Duke stated, each word a perfectly placed, dispassionate stone. "I need a duchess in name for a period of 6 months to satisfy a term in an entail, after which we shall arrange a quiet, generous annulment. She will be a wealthy widow without ever having been a true wife. It is a better offer than the one you are currently considering for her." A chill washed over Clara, so profound it felt like being plunged into icy water. He knew. He knew about the damp-coughed suitor. He had investigated her life and found it wanting, which, perversely, made her suitable for his purpose. She was a blank slate upon which he could write his temporary solution. Her uncle, after a moment of stunned silence, practically sobbed with relief. The deal was struck. Clara felt a strange, hysterical laugh bubbling in her chest. She was being sold, but she had been traded from a mouldering prison to a gilded cage. It was not freedom, but it was a different kind of captivity, and for the first time in years, a flicker of something other than despair ignited within her. It was a cold, hard curiosity. The wedding was a swift, sterile affair at a registry office. Her uncle was the only guest. The Duke of Alvan, Alistair, as she was now to call him, though the name felt foreign and sharp in her mind, stood beside her, a pillar of remote civility. His ink-stained fingers brushed hers as he placed a heavy gold band on her finger. The touch sent a jolt through her, not of affection, but of sheer, unadulterated shock. He was real. This was real. They travelled to his country estate, Alvanstone, in a carriage whose silence was as heavy as wet wool. She watched the rolling green hills pass by, feeling utterly detached, a ghost already haunting her own life. Alvanstone was less a house than a monument, a vast Gothic edifice of grey stone that seemed to command the landscape, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. The inside was just as imposing. Cavernous rooms, soaring ceilings, and acres of polished marble that echoed her footsteps. It was immaculate, cold, and profoundly empty. A staff of silent servants moved like spectres through the halls. Clara was shown to a suite of rooms, a duchess's suite, that was larger than her uncle's entire London house. It was beautiful, luxurious, and felt as personal as a hotel. Their life together fell into a strange formal rhythm. They dined together each evening at opposite ends of a colossal dining table, the distance between them a palpable entity. Their conversation was stilted, a polite exchange of observations about the weather or the estate. He would inquire if she had everything she needed. She would assure him that she did. He spent his days in his study, a room she was not invited to enter. She would see him sometimes walking the grounds, his head bent in thought, his hands clasped behind his back. He was a fortress, self-contained and impenetrable. Clara felt his distance as a physical presence, a wall of glass between them. She was his duchess in name, a placeholder, a piece in a game whose rules she did not understand. And yet there were cracks, tiny hairline fractures in the cold fade. One afternoon she was sketching the formal gardens. A pastime she had clung to as her only private solace. She was using a cheap, worn nub of charcoal. The next morning, a beautiful lacquered box sat on the writing desk in her room. Inside was a complete set of artists' charcoals, fine paper, and expensive pigments. There was no note. Another time, she mentioned in passing at dinner that the scent of lavender reminded her of her mother's garden. A week later, she awoke to find the air sweet with it. From her window, she saw that an entire section of the gardens below had been replanted with hundreds of lavender bushes. When she tried to thank him, he simply inclined his head. The estate has gardeners, Duchess. It is their job to cultivate the grounds. These gestures were confusing. They were thoughtful, yet deeply impersonal, as if he were curating her existence rather than participating in it. He saw her, he observed her preferences, but he did not engage with her. It was as if he were tending to a rare, delicate plant he had acquired, ensuring its conditions were perfect while keeping it under glass. Her curiosity about him grew, a slow, creeping vine. One evening, driven by a loneliness so sharp it felt like hunger, she wandered the quiet corridors of the West Wing. A sliver of light shone from beneath the door of his study. She hesitated, her heart hammering, then drew closer. The door was not quite shut. She peered through the narrow opening. The room was lined with books from floor to ceiling. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows, and in the centre of the room, Alistair sat at a small table, utterly absorbed. On the table was a magnificent ivory chess set. He was playing against himself, his ink-stained fingers moving a white knight, then pausing, his brow furrowed in concentration, before his other hand moved a black bishop to counter. The sight was strangely intimate. Here was the Duke, not as a ruthless magnate or a cold husband, but as a man locked in a silent, solitary battle. He was both sides of the conflict, the attacker and the defender. The image lodged itself in her mind. He was not just a fortress, he was a fortress under siege from within. Their fragile, silent truce was shattered by the arrival of Lord Harrington. He was, she learned, Alistair's distant cousin and the rival claimant mentioned in that first overheard conversation. Harrington was a man who seemed to ooze a cloying, false charm. His smile never reached his eyes, which were small and perpetually assessing. He came to Alvanstone for dinner, his presence filling the vast dining room with a new and unwelcome tension. He directed most of his conversation to Clara, his questions slick with insinuation. "And how are you finding country life, Duchess?" he asked, his voice smooth as oil. It must be quite the change. The Duke is known for his singular focus. I trust he is not neglecting his beautiful new bride. Clara felt Alistair's gaze on her from the far end of the table. It was sharp, watchful. She knew, with sudden clarity, that this was a test. Her answer mattered. Taking a slow sip of water, she met Lord Harrington's gaze with a cool she did not know she possessed. On the contrary, she said, her voice even. I find the Duke's focus to be one of his most admirable qualities. Unlike the divided attentions of London, it is refreshing to be in the company of a man who knows precisely what he wants. She let the statement hang in the air, a subtle but unmistakable rebuke. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the barest flicker of something in Alistair's expression. Surprise? Approval? Harrington's smile tightened. He tried again later, catching her alone in the drawing room. "A most impressive performance, Lady Clara," he murmured, stepping closer. "But we are alone now. You need not keep up the pretense for me. A marriage of convenience is no great scandal, but a duke's title resting on it? That is another matter. You would find me a far more grateful benefactor." The implication was vile, slithering into the air between them. Before, she might have shrunk away, intimidated, but weeks of being the Duchess of Alvan, of living in this vast, silent house and watching its master, had forged something new in her. A spine of cold steel. "Lord Harrington," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, forcing him to lean in. "You mistake me for someone who can be bought. My uncle already holds that distinction. My husband, the Duke, bought me from him. I assure you, the price has been paid in full. You are in no position to bid." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his face a mask of stunned fury. She did not look back, but she felt Alistair's presence in the doorway. He had heard, he had witnessed her defence, not just of their arrangement, but of him. That night at dinner the silence was different. It was no longer empty, but charged with unspoken words. The wall of glass between them had begun to crack. The pressure from Harrington mounted in the following weeks. Rumours circulated. Insinuations about the legitimacy of the marriage appeared in gossip columns. Alistair grew more remote than ever, his face a mask of controlled tension. The 6-month deadline loomed, only 2 months away, coinciding with his 33rd birthday. Clara felt the atmosphere in the house grow heavy, charged like the air before a storm. The fragile peace she had found was eroding. She could no longer drift through her days. She had defended this arrangement, made herself a part of it. She deserved to understand the battle she was fighting. She found him in the library late one night, not with his chest set, but staring into the fire, a glass of brandy in his hand. His posture was rigid with strain. She did not announce herself, simply moving to stand near the hearth. He looked up, his dark blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "You should be in bed," he said. It was not a command, but a statement of fact, weary and flat. "I can't sleep," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "This house is full of ghosts, and I find I don't know their names." She looked at him directly. "Why me, Alistair? The truth, not the clinical assessment you gave my uncle. Why did you choose me?" He was silent for a long moment, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. The firelight played across the hard planes of his face. She expected a deflection, another cool, businesslike response. Instead, he let out a long, shuddering breath. "Because you were quiet," he said, his voice raw. "Because you seemed safe." Uncomplicated, he looked away from her, into the flames. It was a grotesque miscalculation. He told her everything then. The words came out not in a flood, but haltingly, as if he were pulling them from a deep, painful wound. The entail was real, a bizarre clause left by an eccentric ancestor. If he was unmarried and without prospect of an heir on his 33rd birthday, the primary ducal line, the title, and Alvanstone itself would revert to the line of his great-uncle, Harrington's line. But that was only the mechanism of the trap. The reason he was in it was the true secret. Years ago, he had been deeply in love, a woman named Isabel. He had been prepared to give her everything. But she had not loved him, she had loved his title. She had betrayed him in a cruel and public way, taking his heart and shattering it for sport and ambition. "She taught me that love is a transaction," he said, his voice rough with remembered pain. "A weakness to be exploited. So I built walls. I focused on work, on things I could control. Numbers on a ledger do not lie. Ships follow their course. But I let the deadline for the entail creep up on me, because the idea of opening myself up to that again, it was unthinkable." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing that stunned her. "I chose you, Clara, because I saw your uncle's advertisement for a suitor. I investigated. I saw a woman trapped, quiet. Someone who would likely be grateful for the arrangement and ask for nothing more. I treated you like a solution to a problem, a piece in a game. It was a monstrously selfish act, and I was wrong about you in every possible way." His confession hung in the air between them, devastating in its honesty. He was not a cold, unfeeling machine. He was a man who had been so profoundly wounded that he had tried to amputate his own heart. He had built a fortress not to keep others out, but to keep his own pain locked in. In that moment, she did not feel like a purchased commodity. She felt a wave of empathy so powerful it stole her breath. She saw the man behind the Duke, the lonely figure playing chess against himself because he trusted no one else enough to be his opponent. "You were not entirely wrong," she said softly. "I was quiet. I was trapped. You offered me an escape. But you did not account for the fact that once a person is freed from one cage, they do not simply sit quietly in the next. They begin to remember what it feels like to have a will of their own." His mask of control crumbled. He looked vulnerable, Exposed, he had handed her the truth, a weapon that could destroy him or a key that could unlock his prison. He had made himself utterly, terrifyingly dependent on her mercy. The aftermath of his confession was a profound, aching silence that lasted for 2 days. He avoided her, retreating behind the walls he had just revealed. Clara felt a terrible sorrow. He had shown her his wound, and now, ashamed of the sight, he was pushing her away. On the 3rd morning, there was a knock on the door of her suite. It was not Alistair, it was his valet, Jennings, a man as impeccably formal and remote as his master. He held a silver salver. On it was a thick envelope and a letter. From His Grace the Duke, Jennings said, his face impassive. Clara took the items. Her fingers felt cold and clumsy. She opened the letter first. The handwriting was precise, controlled. It was a letter of dismissal. He wrote that his actions had been unforgivable, that he had used her in a way that he now deeply regretted. He could not, in good conscience, hold her to their bargain. The enclosed envelope, he explained, contained a bank draft for a sum that would ensure her independence for the rest of her life. He would arrange for a quiet annulment. He wished her happiness. It was signed, simply, Alvan. A wave of desolation crashed over her. After everything, after that moment of raw honesty in the library, he was reverting to a transaction. He was paying her off, dismissing her like a servant whose term of employment had ended. He was sending his valet to do it. The insult was as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. She opened the other envelope. The bank draft was for an astronomical sum. It was freedom. It was everything she had never had. She could go anywhere, do anything. She would never be dependent on anyone again. And she had never felt so trapped. The desolation curdled, slowly, into a cold, clear anger. He didn't get to do this. He didn't get to show her the man behind the mask, make her feel empathy and a strange, burgeoning connection, only to decide for her that it was over. He didn't get to sacrifice her for the sake of his own honour. That was not his choice to make. Her gaze swept the room and landed on the charcoals he had given her, on the lavender blooming outside her window, on the memory of him playing chess against himself, his own worst enemy. The pawn. A pawn is the weakest piece on the board, she thought, but if it can make it to the other side, it can become a queen. She knew what she had to do. The decision settled in her, calm and absolute. This was not his move to make, it was hers. She walked, not to her rooms to pack, but straight to his study. She did not knock. She opened the door and stepped inside. The ivory chess set was on its table, the pieces arranged mid-game, exactly as she had seen them before. The solitary battle, frozen in time. Without hesitation, she reached down and picked up a single piece, a white pawn from the front rank. It felt cool and solid in her palm. It was small, insignificant, yet it held the potential for immense power. She turned and walked back to where Jennings still waited, a silent sentinel of her dismissal, in the hall. She held out the bank draft. "Give this back to His Grace," she said, her voice low and steady. He took it, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly. Then she held out her closed hand. She opened her fingers to reveal the ivory pawn. "And give him this," she commanded softly. "Tell him the pawn is off the board. If he wishes to discuss its next move, he will come himself." Jennings stared at the pawn, then at her face. For the first time since she had met him, the valet's professional mask slipped. He saw not a dismissed duchess, but a woman in full command. He gave a short, sharp bow, took the chess piece with the reverence one might afford a crown jewel, and departed. Clara waited. She did not pace, she did not weep. She went to the grand drawing room, with its cold marble fireplace and soaring windows, and she sat. The silence of the house no longer felt oppressive. It was waiting, as she was. It was the held breath before a move was made. It took less than 10 minutes. The doors to the drawing room opened with force. Alistair stood there, his chest heaving as if he had run the length of the house. He was without his coat, his sleeves were rolled up, revealing strong forearms. And his fingers were, she saw, deeply stained with ink. In his hand he clenched the small ivory pawn. His face was stripped of all its defences. No duke, no magnate, just a man utterly undone. His dark blue eyes were wide, with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and a dawning terrified hope. "What is this?" he rasped, holding up the pawn. "What does this mean?" Clara rose to her feet. She did not move toward him. She held her ground. "It means I am not a piece you can sacrifice to make yourself feel noble," she said, her voice clear and strong, ringing in the vast, silent room. "It means I am not a line item in your ledger that you can simply pay off and close out." She took a step closer, her gaze locked with his. "You showed me your weakness, Alistair. Did you think I would use it against you? Or did you think I was so fragile I would shatter at the sight of it? You have been playing a game against yourself for so long you have forgotten how to have a partner." He flinched as if she had struck him. "Clara, I did it to protect you. From me. From this sham, this bargain. You did it to protect yourself," she corrected, her voice softening slightly. "You did it because you are a coward. Not on the battlefield or in the boardroom, but here. In this. You were betrayed, and you have honoured that betrayal for years by letting it define you. You have let Isabel win, every single day." His hand holding the pawn trembled. "What do you want?" He whispered, the question raw, broken. "I want a choice," she declared. "My choice. You do not get to dismiss me. You do not get to decide my future. Our arrangement was for 6 months. I will honour it, but not as your pawn, as your partner, as your duchess. And when the 6 months are over, I will decide if I stay." She took another step until they were barely a foot apart. "And I want you to look at me, truly look at me, and tell me you feel nothing. Tell me I am still just a solution to a problem. If you can do that, I will walk out of this house and never look back." He stared at her, his throat working. The silence stretched, thick with a decade of his pain and a lifetime of her resignation. He looked from her face to the pawn in his hand, then back to her eyes. He saw not the quiet, unassuming girl he had purchased, but the formidable woman who had defended him, who had seen his deepest wound and had not run, and who now stood before him, offering not pity, but an alliance, an equal. With a choked sound, he closed the distance between them. His hands came up to frame her face, his touch hesitant, then firm. His ink-stained thumbs traced the line of her jaw. "I cannot," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "Clara, I cannot. The confession was a surrender. Looking at you, it is the only thing that makes sense anymore." And then he kissed her. It was not a kiss of polite fiction or calculated passion. It was a kiss of desperate, shattering honesty. It was the collapse of a fortress, the end of a solitary game. It was the raw, terrifying, beautiful admission that he was lost, and that she, the pawn he had so carelessly put into play, was the only one who could show him the way home. In his embrace, Clara felt not the closing of a trap, but the opening of a door she had never, ever dared to imagine. A year later, the silence in Alvanstone had a different texture. It was a soft, warm thing, filled with the hum of life. The light poured through the tall windows, no longer seeming cold and grey, but golden and welcoming. The scent of lavender and fresh baked bread drifted from the open doors of the terrace. Clara sat in the garden, a sketchbook open on her lap. But today she was not drawing the flowers. She was sketching her husband, who was on his knees in the dirt, attempting to teach their new, clumsy puppy not to dig up the prize-winning roses. Alistair's fingers were not stained with ink today, but smudged with soil. He looked up and caught her watching, and a slow, easy smile spread across his face. It was a smile she now knew as well as her own reflection. Their 6 months had ended, her choice had been made. Later that evening they sat in the library. The ivory chess set was still on its table, but now it was a source of shared amusement, of quiet competition between them. He was a strategic player, but she was unpredictable, often making moves that seemed illogical but threw his careful plans into disarray. He picked up a white pawn, the very one she had sent back to him, which he now kept on his desk as a paperweight. "I thought I was acquiring a pawn," he said quietly, his eyes full of the love that now lived so easily between them. "Someone to hold a space on the board for a little while." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You were wrong," she said, her voice gentle. "You weren't acquiring a pawn." He smiled, turning his hand to clasp hers. "I know," he said. "I was finding my queen."